en Nuevo Sol Televisión.
Different.
Yeah.
But I'll start with a little bit about myself, then how we got into the paper, and then what we're thinking about moving forward. So my family's from the Dominican Republic. They migrated in the 80s to New York, and then I lived in New Hampshire for a long time. So New Hampshire is a far northeast, 95% white, maybe more. We moved from there to Miami, which is some people call it a global city, has migrants from all over Latin America, the Caribbean. And from there, I went to college in Atlanta, Georgia, which some might consider the deep South. And it has a very different feel than in Miami or New Hampshire, right? So in reflecting on my own experiences, my moving from the Northeast to deep South Miami to the deep South in a different sense, and into Atlanta, Georgia, I noticed how my racialization in those spaces was different, given the social context I was in. And now I'm at the University of South Florida in Tampa, which has a very interesting history with the Caribbean as well, when we consider large Cuban populations that came to do cigar companies and factories, and then a large Afro-Cuban population who segregated, lived with African Americans and other Black ethnic groups who, by law, were kind of relegated to these spaces. So, and even that's kind of what gave birth to this paper. Conversations between my mentor and I about kind of these different racial dynamics. And clearly, like Profe said, we know that Afro-Latinos or Black Latinos or Black Latin Americans have existed forever, right? And they've had an impact all around the world and in the United States, and in particular, for a very long time. So we went out to investigate what is it that these people, what is it that this particular group is experiencing, and how can we understand their identity formation given different social historic context, given different nationalities, countries of origin, so on and so forth. So that's what gave birth to the paper. Prophet told me that you all were assigned to read the paper, and there's still so much more data that we have to kind of parse through, because we focused a lot on the role of the family, the role of institutions in shaping racial identity and ethnic identity even. But really, that's a process that we all experience, right? So it's not just these groups who are more or less in a middle, as some would say, between Black and Latino or Latinx. But various groups experience these types of racialization experiences. But really, what's left in the data is something. There's so much more. Considering, like I said, when people migrate, where they're migrating from, if they're migrating from a country that's already predominantly Black, or a country that has a significant history to other Black ethnic groups, and we kind of discussed a little bit about that. So that's what brought us to the paper, and a little bit about myself. So I'll open it up to anything that you all want to ask regarding the study, or even what you all had in mind about your own studies or projects.
I'll ask a question. So this is like something that I've been following for a while, just because I've seen different pieces done about Afro-Latinos and things like that. And the biggest thing is about like you don't fit in with either your Latin community or your Black community, right? Mm-hmm. How do you personally handle that? Like, kind of like, like you're not accepted by, sometimes not by either, or sometimes by, not necessarily like your close family, like your immediate family, but like your uncles and like your tias and all that stuff. So how did you deal with that, or was your experience different?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because I think and this is probably true for a lot of Latin Americans, that families kind of can span the spectrum. It's not true for all, but it's definitely true for many in terms of phenotype. And I think one thing that is particular to my case is that I'm here in the United States, right? So on the island, my experience would be very, very different. In the U.S., particularly in moving to Atlanta, Georgia, I had an experience where, like a lot of the respondents we saw in the study, where Latin Americans were not particularly embracing of me, where black ethnic groups were, right? And that was part of part of what we saw in the article too, where people didn't quite know where they fit, but some groups were building community with them and other groups were not, right? Via colorist messages or messages about phenotype. Why is your hair like this? Why is your nose like that, right? So these types of things, I think were true for me, but also true for a lot of other people in our study. And again, this is going to vary depending on the individual, depending on their phenotype, and again where they're coming from, what country, their family composition, even how early they are in their migration experience. We've seen that in other studies, right, where people who are more recently migrated may have a different experience than someone who's what they call like a 1.5 generation, who comes as a young child, versus someone who's a first generation. So these things are going to kind of shape people's identity as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, so like, I guess I've always been interested in like place making and perhaps like unconventional spaces, like maybe like the town pub or like the barber shop, the nail salon. And I was kind of interested in like how much you emphasize that like the social media spaces are like community building spaces for a lot of Afro-Latinx community members. So can you like expand more in that topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, it ties back to what our colleague had said earlier, where people aren't fitting in squarely into one category or the other. People kind of seek other ways to build community. And I think the rise of social media in the last 15 or so years is going to give people the opportunity to connect with other people who are like them, are facing similar struggles. So I wouldn't even say this is unique to racial or ethnic minorities. There are other people with various positionalities, statuses, or identities that go online to seek community in a different way that they're not able to get in person. So for respondents in our study, we found a lot of folks who were saying like, hey, I didn't even know this was a term, Afro-Latinx. I didn't even know this thing existed. And when I found it, I was like, hey, this applies to me. This is my experience. And sometimes people talked about stumbling on it from looking at other things. So for Black Latinx women in particular, for example, would say things like finding ways to do their hair, right? So even trying to find a hair community, finding different styles, and finding different ways to do your hair, people would say, hey, there's a significant Afro-Latinx community talking about different hairstyling choices, textures, etc. And this is going to be something that I'm into. And that's actually part of our recruiting technique, looking into different hashtags, right? And we see this is something, and a lot of people, or more people are picking this up. I know Dr. Simmons, who's at the University of South Carolina, she's an anthropologist. She's doing work on Black women's hair in the Dominican Republic, and how people are using hair as a means to connect back to their Africanness, right? Because as we know, skin color is a big thing, but hair texture in many circles, and even in our study, is sometimes more indicative of a racialization, or more important in a racialization phenomena. So that's a very good question. But yeah, I think future studies could expand that more and kind of and delve into that a little bit more.
Let me ask you this, as Melody asked you about the social media as this space that community can be built, right? People can sort of discover their identity. If we're going to carry out a project that is media based, is it better for us to emphasize social media content to reach out a community that we just don't know how is it out there, right? And I think in some places of the US is much more different, right? To capture this community. We're not in Florida where there's an incredible influence, right, of Afro-Latinos in the state. So California is a little bit more diluted. So do you think is the best space for us to circulate whatever is it that we're going to do and help people understand and raise a little bit of awareness about the topic?
So is the question about disseminating material, or is it about
disseminating material?
Yeah, I absolutely think that social media is an effective tool. I think I would also add that one of our recruitment strategies was just DMing or messaging, private messaging, some Instagram accounts, some Twitter accounts, say, hey, we're some researchers, we're doing this, we're interested in this. Would you be interested in either posting this for us or talking with us? And all they saw was we made an account, University of South Florida, to do this recruitment. So all they saw was a school title and like 2 sociologists, nothing about our appearance, nothing about our identities. So when I sent the message, they posted the flyer to help us recruit, but they all said, like, look at these blanquitos that want to look into our lives. So I think, they say that in jest, but I think that the thing that's underscoring that is, I don't think people don't want to be treated like a spectacle, or people don't want to be exoticized. And I'm sure you all know these things, right? So I think I would recommend, snowball sampling, going through folks that you already know, or outlets that you already know. And even, we piloted the study, or piloted the questions to see how these questions come off. Because a lot of times people put out information, and it's not in the lens or through even the vocabulary that particular groups want. And again, that is, while the intent is good, the impact may not be. So it's important to be careful to be in close community in terms of similar goals and outcomes when creating material and disseminating material.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that, and also for emphasizing the idea of how we can be close to the community and sensitive to the community as well, right?
Absolutely.
Not necessarily just profit from them or from their stories, which is hard to do in journalism, right? So guys, more questions. Brian, I know you have tons of questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Cynthia. You're ready, Cynthia?
Oh, yeah. So my question was, in the research, I saw a lot of statistics on like census and how people don't really mark it down. So do you think like if documents like census or other important documents like change their options to have more a variety of races, or like the way you identify yourself, do you think people would be more comfortable in answering those questions if there was more options?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer is yes. I think a lot of people for many years, and not just in our study, but have talked about not being able to see themselves reflected on census data. And that's because the racial categories are, socially constructed, and they don't really mean much of anything. I mean, they have a lot of social impact, but they don't mean anything in and of themselves. And they are, quite frankly, ineffective in what they're doing, right? I use this example when I teach my race and ethnicity class. When you look at the category Asian, right, which is this broad category that's going to be over 25 countries, over half of the world's population, and we're gonna categorize it in one thing. So in short, I think people would definitely be more open to that. And in fact, before the 2020 census, they were in conversations, particularly groups in New York. There's a huge Afro-Latino contingency in New York. In fact, they had the Afro-Latino Festival. They usually have it every summer. So that may be a good place to start for you all. Obviously, they won't have it this year, but looking into those networks to see what type of information might be useful for them in disseminating. But groups out of New York were working on creating an Afro-Latino category for the census. Now, in addition to MENA, which is Middle Eastern North African, right? So people have been pushing and advocating for changes in the census to address that very thing. Now, the implications of what that might mean for pan-racial or other group solidarity, I don't know. That's a different conversation. But yeah, I think in short, people would kind of welcome that. A lot of people would welcome something like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can go now. I know you talked about social media, and that's what I was trying to do, was trying to pull up my questions that I had submitted. And I know that in one of them I had talked about if we're kind of evolving towards accepting different, groups that are part of the Latin community. But I was wondering too, like a lot of celebrities are of, these backgrounds too. Like, do you think they're, making a great impact on the community and bringing more awareness? For example, I wanted to bring a really good person to mind, but the only person I can think of right now is Cardi B. She speaks Spanish. She's of African descent, of Afro-Latin descent. And I think they're, like the audience that they have right now, like they're bringing more awareness to these groups. So do you think that's positively affecting it, or is it just social media, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think generally what our respondents would say is that there's not enough representation, and you spoke to that as well. I think Cardi B is in the right direction, but then the other conversation is, well, what does Cardi B look like, right? She's on the lighter side for sure, right? So it's also there is this representation, but at the expense of what? So is it, Amara La Negra from she's a Dominican pop star and singer. She's from Dominican Republic. She lives in Miami. She's dark skinned, Afro textured hair, and someone like that really makes people contend with this idea of a Latin person that is unambiguously phenotypically Black. And I think like that, in my personal opinion, is better representation. Now that's not to say that Cardi B's representation isn't important, but I think the type of representation also matters. And again, when we're showing these disjunctures between these alleged disjunctures between Latinx and Black, when we show someone like Amara La Negra, who is again dark brown skinned, Afro textured hair, we as a society are forced to confront this idea that these people exist and they look like this, right? So I think it's definitely a positive thing that we have kind of maybe some people would argue, and maybe myself too, a resurgence in kind of Black identity, Black community, probably given the state of what's been happening in the U.S. for maybe the last 15 years, especially. Yeah, so that in short, that's probably what I would what I would how I would respond to that. I don't know if you all have seen from the same data my mentor published with a colleague of mine on Afro-Latinos and Black Lives Matter, and kind of that kind of synergy there. So I think it might be an interesting article if you all haven't already seen it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else? Camille?
I have a question. It's pretty broad, but I wanted to know your like personal opinion. Like, why do you think that Afro-Latinos aren't represented enough in the U.S.? Like, do you think it's because there aren't enough like people out there showing it, or they're embarrassed because it's like normalized that being Black or dark is not a good thing?
Okay, so I will say I don't think it's because people themselves are embarrassed to be dark-skinned. In fact, I would say maybe the opposite in some ways. I feel people are really embracing their very quote-unquote Afrocentric features and Blackness. I will say though that society in general tends to favor lighter-skinned people, right? So we talk about colorism a lot in the piece. But one thing that I think maybe even my future work will try to reflect is this idea of like inter and intra-racial colorism. So, or intra and intra-ethnic colorism. So colorism within the group and colorism beyond the group. And when we see across the board, from Hollywood to music industries, people are going to favor lighter skin, right? It's no coincidence that the top artists oftentimes are lighter skinned. It's not because those people are more gifted necessarily, right? It's because they want to find the combination of talent and phenotype, and in the U.S. that's people who approximate whiteness, whatever that means, and in a particular time period are going to be advantaged. So, there are definitely a lot of Black Latinos in the U.S., Latinx in the U.S. I think we started the article even something like 24%. 24% of Latinx are identifying as Afro-Latinx, and that's a huge contingency. So yeah, that it's just gonna boil down to colorism and prejudice and discrimination among other things, but and reflected in broader society.
Thank you. And then I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Like besides social media and just trying to embrace and educate others, like what are other ways like us students can address this issue without being like offensive, especially if we can't like personally relate, because
Right.
I would love to speak about this topic.
One thing that I see a lot, particularly among other Black Latinx folks, is notions of immigration, right? So we talk about immigration as a serious issue, and it is, right? People are being made stateless, undocumented, liminal legality, all that runs the spectrum. But in that imaginary of what a undocumented person is or isn't, Black people are often excluded from that. And that's curious, given that Black people are more likely to be stopped, detained, arrested, and in some instances deported. So we have this unique concoction where the group that is most marginalized in some respects, in many respects, is not included in the conversation of immigration. And even so-called well-to-do hashtags, for example, one that got a lot of flack recently was like Latinos for Black Lives. It's like, well, you're in saying something like that, you're trying to show unity and solidarity with the Black contingency. At the same time, you're saying implicitly that there are not Black people in the Latino group already. So being very careful about one's language, and even considering that issues that seem to only affect one group affect multiple groups and multiple people within that group that are often excluded. So that's a very good question. But
Thank you.
These guys are asking good questions, so that some of them are pretty shy or they're having trouble connecting. Jasmine, you're ready to ask questions?
Yeah. Oh, what? Which Jasmine?
Oh, Cardenas. She was
Oh.
suddenly popping up.
I had a question. I had noticed in the reading that a lot of the internalized racism and colorism comes from the elders. And I just wanted to ask, like, have you personally had any conversations with elders or know of people who've had conversations with elders regarding that?
So
like
my family's from the Dominican Republic, and almost, without fail, every generation back is a little bit darker. And I don't know if people are out here intentionally, we have to, marry light, but we saw the result of that. So yeah, definitely, I've heard these comments from the darkest people in my family, the darkest skinned folks in my family are the ones sometimes saying these things, in addition to the lighter skinned folks and whatnot. In terms of our study in particular, there weren't too many elders, quote unquote, that spoke directly about this. And those that did, would say the same things, the being told from a child to stay out of the sun, the whole gambit. There was one participant in particular who he also from the Dominican Republic, dark brown skin, Afro textured hair, and he grew up always and his family said everyone had a nickname, where this, that, and the third. His nickname was Narizón, right? Big nose, right? And he's like, yeah, but it doesn't mean anything. It's a term of endearment, da da da. But then he also later on in the interview, that was one of my longer interviews, he reveals, like, now that I think about it, I had the broadest nose in my family, the most Afrocentric feature, and right, even in isolating that and being that being someone's nickname, he ended up revealing in that interview, reflecting in that interview, like, hey, maybe that was rooted in some anti-Blackness, or maybe that's rooted in something. It wasn't just a nickname that they gave me as a term of endearment. And we see a lot of these things in various ethnic groups, among African Americans, terms like light bright, or some other ones that are more derogatory, referring to skin tone. So we see these implicit messages that are passed on to the family, and then unfortunately sometimes they're again internalized and practiced by those individuals, and then it perpetuates the system and so on.
Right. I guess more so, like, what I'm asking is there becoming like conversations to target, like, I guess that internalized racism and colorism, like for family members who are a bit older, like who did grow up with this and who do also like continue to enforce that? Like, are there conversations like happening now, like how to talk to your family about that? Like, are you seeing anything like that?
I would say yes. And I think the best example that I can think of, at least from the data, would have to do with people refusing to straighten their hair anymore. So again, this is for Black women in our study. They were like, you know what, I've been straightening my hair for these many years and everyone in my family likes it, but I want to rock my afro. I want to rock my natural curls. And that statement in and of itself, one, was a point of contention in the family, like, hey, go ahead and do your hair for God's sake, right? But the message was, like, I'm going to embrace who I am, and what my features are. And again, sometimes there was those conversations following that, like, hey, no, I like this. This is who I am. And a big part of that was from the study, again, when people learned about their history in a different way. A lot of people don't know, I'm sure you probably have some exposure to it, that the majority of enslaved Africans ended up in Latin America, the Caribbean, Brazil especially, right? So there's this very rich tradition, again, with Cimarron communities and whatnot. So when people learn about that and embrace that history, in addition to their friends and their different peer groups, that type of kind of environment in some ways re-socializes people to embrace and then push back on family members that are, have colorist messages and even anti-Black messages, sometimes being Black themselves. So yes, so I would say in those ways, then those conversations are happening.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
Elizabeth had a question, but I think her internet's
I think Elizabeth was in a phone, and she sent me a message. Are you ready, Elizabeth? Oh, you put it on
she put it on the chat.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it?
Oh, okay. I see.
Can you read it, Edlin?
Mm-hmm. Are
Elizabeth?
authentic Latinos pushing Afro-Latinos to identify as Black for their own self-preservation? Huh. All right. Let me read it again. I want to make sure I pushing to identify as Black. So
that's a lot of question mark about what is an authentic Latino, right?
Yeah. And I guess the second part, for their own self-preservation, I'm not too sure about. But I'll say this: there's definitely like boundary work and policing that's done around racial and ethnic identities. So in the article, we saw people where there was an incongruence with people who are phenotypically Black, but then speaking Spanish, and that did not register to some people. Why is this person speaking Spanish? In my time in Atlanta, when I worked as a social worker, and sometimes we'd have migrant groups from Latin America come in. I would speak to them in Spanish, and people were surprised. And where did you learn Spanish? How did you learn Spanish? It's like, well, it's my native tongue, right? And even for me, who is light skinned, and right. So imagine what it's like for people who are darker skinned and have other features that are more indicative of African heritage. So I think there's definitely some boundary work that people are doing to determine who's in this group and who's in that group. I think on the other side of that, there are other Black ethnic groups who are pushing, in some instances, pushing Afro-Latinos to identify as Black in ways that perhaps they didn't. So we had one participant in our study, I think, that really represented this well. She was Jamaican and Mexican, mom and dad are Jamaican Mexican. And she talked about moving from Texas and being again in that middle category that we talked about, too Black for the Mexicans. And these are her words, right? Too Black to be with the Mexican kids, too Mexican to be with the Black kids. She went to school in Mississippi. If you know anything about Mississippi, this is the deep South in the truest sense of the word. And there she was pushed. I don't want to say pushed, but she was embraced by the Black community there, mostly Black American, African American community, and like, hey, no, like you may be mixed over there or not sure over there, but over here you're Black. Like, come sit with us. And it was that kind of sentiment. So there's definitely policing and boundary work around identities, and to the extent that there's an agenda behind it, I'm not sure. I don't know if I could speak to that necessarily, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some motivation to have folks in group or out group, right? So I hope that can answer some of your question.
Yeah, I think you did. Somebody else a question. Even those who wrote in Spanish, like Jonathan, I know he speaks Spanish, so he can understand you if you want to post it in Spanish. In the meantime, what they gained the strength to ask you questions. Let me ask you this question, Edlin. Your article says that the university plays a positive role in helping Afro-Latino students to find their identity, right? To find that history that was denied to them in many cases, right? Because they have access to courses in African American studies, they have access to a whole bunch of people and also professors that help create some kind of a more welcoming environment for the students to explore their own history, their own identity, right? Without being policed or questioned. How do you think, and I don't know if you know of somebody who's doing also research on this, right? How universities can make an intentional part of their work to create these spaces for Afro-Latino students, right? I'm asking also this question in a selfish way, because the university that we are at is predominantly Latino, right? It's now majority, like about 60%, almost 60% Latino now. It's gonna remain like that for a while. And yet there is not much crossover, right? The students can take some courses in Africana studies, which we have a department on that, right? And then we have a Chicano studies department, and we have a Central American studies department, but there's by and large no connection, right? And no recognition. And I think as students, in a way, they find hard to find places to create that community that they need in our campus, right?
Ooh, that's a big question, and I think one way to start that bridge, if you will, is thinking about race in a global sense. And I think a lot of the downside of a lot of the ways that race is taught in the U.S. is from a very U.S. centric model that focuses on the very important history in the United States, but that history is not one that's independent of Latin America. And in fact, those two things are forged simultaneously and are continuing to be forged that way. And so to that extent, when we're thinking about Blackness, I think it's important to always present Blackness as this diasporic entity, as this diasporic idea that encompasses the entire Americas, and then obviously the continent and other places. But I always frame, when I'm always talking about my work, I say I'm a sociologist, I'm a qualitative sociologist. I study racialization among African-descended peoples in the Americas, because there's no other way to do it without doing it just justice, or without doing it incorrectly. Really, you have to take on this global perspective. So I think from that stance, being able to incorporate histories, interconnected histories that a lot of people aren't aware of. When we're thinking about the Haitian Revolution, what that means for other Latin American countries, what that means for the U.S. South, what that means for Black Americans in the South, right? So these things are connected, and they always have been. So to present them as such it's just a historical, really. So I think being able to have these conversations in a global way, to really wake people up in some ways about the connectedness of Blackness in diasporically.
Yeah, thanks for the example. These guys visited. We had an event last Friday, and another doctoral student in history, Jason Porter, he made the point about exactly what you are saying, right? How Mexican Black history, or Mexican history in reality, how Black history is central to Mexico, but it's also central to the U.S. and to that period of runaway slaves, right? How it is really a Black president in Mexico who gets rid of slavery, right? And that creates the space for runaway slaves that go south, right? And how that is connected to the history of the U.S. as well.
Absolutely. I see a question in the chat.
There's a question in the chat. I think Jonathan probably doesn't have a good connection, so he's putting his question there.
Okay, so the question is, we know that saying improving the race or mejorando la raza is problematic, it misinforms people. How can students educate their parents regarding this topic? And how can students do it? With a lot of repetition, because when when these things are so ingrained in everyday language, it's something that can't be unlearned. So they're hearing this. A lot of times, parents are hearing this from their great grandparents, who are, and perhaps unbeknownst to them, perpetuating something that they think is positive, and in some instances was beneficial to them in their immediate surroundings, right? So to have lighter skin in Latin America was a benefit. I mean, in the U.S. too, right? But it was beneficial, right? So people were doing it to benefit themselves socially, materially. Now, obviously, what underscores that is rampant anti-Blackness and so forth. But I think it's getting people to question, what do they mean? To improve a race means what? It means that that a race needs to be improved, and then thinking about it in a way where what race needs to be improved allegedly, and what are we improving it to, and why is that the direction, right? So having people think critically about what it is that we're saying, how we're saying it, that has worked. That has worked for me in my classrooms. It has worked with family members, with friends, and not just with this issue, right? We talk about colorism in different aspects, but I think what a lot of people don't. Sometimes that stuff doesn't resonate, and I like to tie things again to structure. So things that are structurally in place. So when we say, at the same time that they were doing these blanqueamiento movements or whatever, they were also saying, hey, we want Europeans to migrate to these countries, and we're not going to let other ethnic groups, particularly black ethnic groups, to migrate. And that's an oversimplification, but in generally, you had these groups coming in, and sometimes with benefits. We're going to say, hey, we're going to take some people from these places, we're going to give them land, we're going to give them rights, and we don't want Black people, so we're going to try to whiten the country. So we take that from the macro level. At the micro level, someone's saying we need to improve the race. And when people can make that connection, like, dang, this is really tied to some racist stuff from back in the day, sometimes it resonates, but it's definitely a conversation that takes time and patience, and repetition for sure.
Thanks for making that connection. These guys learned last week as well, as they were talking about this issue about Mexico, right? That the idea of mestizaje, and obviously the idea of the cosmic race introduced by Vasconcelos, is exactly what you're describing, right? Is the idea of bringing Europeans to Mexico, give them land, and help the nation to become better or wider, right? To create this mythic cosmic race, which is essentially an hegemonic construct, right?
Absolutely.
That mestizaje erases Blackness and erases indigenous people from Mexico at the same time. And now let me ask you this: do you think that the construct of Hispanic and Latino does exactly the same thing? I'm particularly concerned about the country you're from, right? Because your family is from. Because when we speak about Hispanic, it means that this beautiful island of Española is divided into the Spanish speakers, right? Dominicans, and the people that are more essentially associated with Blackness, right? People from Haiti are excluded, right? And the same goes for Latinos, right? To some degree, it includes a little bit more of this Blackness in the label, but it's not necessarily there. So I want to see your thoughts about this.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I've through my schooling, I've struggled with the term Latino, Latinx, and Hispanic because of what it does and what it doesn't do. So what it does, it offers a very diverse group some sort of political agenda, right? So it's a tool to politicize around. Now we have a huge contingency. Latinx make up 16% of the population or something like that. So that's a sizable. So now there's a group that can mobilize. What that does, though, it paints a picture, a hegemonic picture of this is what this large political group needs, this is what they look like, this is where they're from. And it leaves out indigenous folks, it leaves out Black folks, it leaves out the very distinctions that make the different nationalities what they are, who they are, right? So for example, if we talk about the Cuban experience in the United States, has been by and large very different than a lot of other Latin American folks, particularly white Cubans, right? So this is a very distinct experience, but to then categorize that same experience under Latinx or Hispanic has its downfalls for sure. To your other point about the Island of Hispaniola, yeah, right. So we have, again, the divisions are going to be made between a place that is imagined as explicitly Black and African versus a place that is imagined to be more European, more mixed than their peers to the West. So it does some things, and then it does a lot of bad things, or things that make it difficult for groups, marginalized groups within that contingency to kind of to advance.
Oh, let me see somebody else. Questions? See, when you have a group of journalists, you have very few questions.
They're all writing, I bet.
Come on, guys. Who was going to speak?
Yeah,
Melody.
Yeah, I was actually gonna. One of the questions I formulated, I know after like reading your article, it kind of had to do with like this topic that was just addressed. I guess I was kind of curious about like the individuals that you like contacted to write the article, if they found the term Afro-Latinx like problematic because it glosses over you know, a lot of things. So that's kind of yeah, can you speak to that maybe?
Yeah, so from the study, I can't recall anyone that found the term explicitly problematic. There were, however, a smaller number of people that preferred to just be identified as Black. And then again, that wasn't in negation of their Latinidad, but it was just like, no, I'm a Black person, right? It was kind of like, I've always been a Black person. I am a Black person. This Afro-Latinx title or identity is not doing anything for me. And one person that comes to mind, he was from Honduras. I don't think his excerpts made it into the article, but he was fascinating because he was from Honduras, but his family was from Haiti and Jamaica, but he was born in Honduras. So now we have a francophone, anglophone kind of mix, and then but born in Honduras and working the banana plantations. So there's a lot of kind of factors into his identity. But from what he communicated, he had always identified himself as a Black person who grew up speaking both English and Spanish simultaneously, and in Honduras. So Afro-Latinx as a category, you know, he didn't find it problematic, but it wasn't something that was useful to him to grasp onto, because of what I suspect was his lineages, his ancestral lineages prior to Honduras. So yeah, I would say that. I guess I can't speak much more. I can't speak on that much more than that from the data that we have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jasmine Navarrete, you have a question?
I have the same question as Jonathan, actually, just about how to educate our families and how to approach the subject of colorism, but it was answered.
Okay.
Well, that's beautiful. We have a student from the Department of Geography, Kelly. Kelly, you're listening to this conversation, and obviously you're going to be working on on a mapping project, right? You're a grad student as well. What do you think about this? And if you have any question for Edlin?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to crash in this class. I really learned a lot. I'm not a Latino, Hispanic, or African American. Actually, I'm Asian. So I think as I can't say I'm an outsider, like a person from other culture. It's hard for me to understand this Afro-Latino concept at the first place when I heard about it. And I'm assuming that because as a geographer, I noticed that the census tract, they didn't include Afro-Latino or Black alone, that it has the Latino ancestor in their census population for a long time. So I wonder how to pick up the connection to teach the next generation about this concept, because I think a lot of people nowadays, they are not paying not paying attention to this, but it's like they will more identify themselves into a bigger group, like you just said, like Latino or Africa. So I just think how to redirect them into the community that they belongs to.
That's a good question, and a tough one too, because I think given the social historic history of the United States and the political ideologies for a long time, people who are racialized as Black, independent of where they're from, so they could be from the continent, maybe Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, wherever, on site they may be racialized. They'll be racialized as Black oftentimes, and then assumed to be maybe African American even, which is in some ways it's not accounting for their ethnicity, right? It's not accounting for their cultural heritage or their ancestry, in terms of the Latin Americans, or not any of that. So I think in many ways what I said earlier about displaying and talking about the diversity that exists within the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, that will give people hopefully that will give people the tools to say, hey, just because someone's Black doesn't mean they're necessarily African American. And in fact, a lot of people in my study, in this study, particularly those who were very, very dark brown skinned, they took issue with being misidentified. Now, undergirding that, I think, was also other things that we could talk about, but people did not want to be misidentified as another race, as another ethnic group, because they were very prideful of where they come from. So I think, again, it's just a matter of being able to expose people to the variety of Blackness, just like the variety of Latinidad, variety of even terms like indigenous, right? So we have these groupings, and I spoke about Asian earlier, how it doesn't encompasses this large thing, but it's not really telling us anything descriptively. And being able to get into the finer details of what these categories mean and what people look like, or where they come from, I think will be important. So I think education is going to be huge. I think it's a shame that people oftentimes have to wait to college to get this type of information. That's a larger educational issue where slavery is taught in 2 pages, and sometimes they use words like servants instead of saying folks were enslaved. So that's a larger issue, but I think introducing people to these ideas from an earlier age, before college, even maybe even before high school, if possible, I think would be a good first step to kind of address that issue.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about education in the elementary school, or even in the preschool is very important to help those students to shape their world of different ethnicities. Sorry, I forgot the word about the races. But I also think because a lot of Afro-Latino, they have immigrated to the US for so long and they forgot their family history, that they actually have the African side in their family and they kind of just forgot about it. So do you have any idea like how can we help them to pick up their memory or like find their history of their Afro-Latino side, like by looking at the distribution of the Black population or Latino population? Because I know when the first immigration wave come to America, there might be some distribution, like the certain group tend to crash together. I don't know whether you have that experience or idea.
So there's definitely going to be patterns of where certain Latin American groups end up. By and large, from any of the data that I've seen, it's been a while since I looked at it kind of closely, but the Northeast, so New York, New Jersey is going to have a very large Afro-Latino population, then followed by Miami, and then right maybe in the Southwest, but I think that's gonna be like Professor said, diluted some. So there's definitely patterns regarding that. I will say I think I'd be cautious to say if these groups forgot about their ancestry or about their history. I think rather that it's and which is common for a lot of migrant groups, in finding a new place in a host country, folks have to in some ways shed some of their old things, a lot of times for survival. So even when I was in New Hampshire, I don't have this accent when I speak English now, and that was intentionally because I was placed in these classes to fix my accent because it was really pronounced. And I think that small example is indicative of folks who have to in some ways assimilate, to the extent that it's possible in a country, and try to get ahead. So I don't know if I would say that folks are forgetting where they're from. I think that folks maybe are never introduced to their full histories. I know for myself, I didn't learn anything about the Dominican Republic, at least extensively, until college. And again, as we saw in the study, a lot of folks didn't either. So yeah, I think it's a difficult question to kind of address head on, but I think that combination of things is going to be what's impacting folks' journey to their identity or not.
Thanks, Edlin. Jasmine Navarrete, she has a question for you.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, just because I used to be a Dutch studies major, and as a hearing, as you, one of the first things you learn is that as a hearing person, you can't, like, how do I say it? Okay, you can be an ally. You can offer support when it's their journey to get representation, and the right representation. You have to be an ally. You have to be supportive. You can educate yourself and educate others, but you can't really like take charge. That's something that's kind of frowned upon. So my question is, how do non-Afro-Latinos help Afro-Latinos get representation? And is there something that shouldn't be done? Is there something that's frowned upon? If like, how do you help Afro-Latinos get representation the right way?
Well, that's a tough question. I think finding out and learning what the greatest needs are in the community, I think, is the first step. And also, like you said, it's a thin line, because one does not want to overshadow or take lead on the issues of a particular group, especially if they're not doing it with that group in mind. So I would say getting getting in with community organizers and finding out what the particular cause is that specific organization is pushing for. You know, a lot of times it can just be as much as supporting folks. Hey, this I experienced this microaggression, you know, last week in class, and being able to speak up on behalf of people, not for them, right, but advocating. Hey, I know this happened, and this is wrong, and this is why I think it's wrong. So being an ally, I think, means sometimes being vulnerable and being wrong. Sometimes that means you have your good intention, but you do the wrong thing. And I think that's a learning process that allies sometimes have to go through, right? You're not going to always be the best ally. You're not always not going to do things the right way. But if you're willing to learn and to be vulnerable, and put yourself in positions to be helpful, I think that says a lot. Again, doing so in a way that's respectful and not overbearing to the community in which you are organizing with or advocating for.
Thank you.
I muted myself. I'm sorry. Somebody else had a question. I have tons of questions for you, Edlin. Let me ask you something about what these people are gathering their thoughts. The Pew Research Center survey, when they ask about Afro-Latino identity, I think one of the points that they made is that a very few a number of people identify themselves within that group as Black. How do you attribute that to what is going on here, right? I know I have had in the past some students actually from the Dominican Republic that say, well, I didn't know I was Black until I came here, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you read those results from the Pew Research Center? What are they telling us?
So, you know, I would say a few things. I think first, in the U.S. context, Blackness is almost automatically attributed to African Americanness or Black American. And in that respect, like I was mentioning earlier, some folks want to be seen as Black, Afro-Latinx people that they are. So I had, again, one Dominican in our study who was dark-skinned, unambiguously Black in all respects, and he would identify as Afro-Latinx and recognize that he himself was Black. But when asked how he identifies, he would say Dominican. And it's just a matter of people preferring their nation of origin over kind of an explicit racial categorization. Now, this particular individual also kind of espoused some anti-Black and anti-African American sentiments in that same breath. So, you know, he was also socially distancing himself, not in a quarantine sense, but in the kind of in a cultural way from another group, right? So he did not want to be maligned he did not want to be associated with a group that's maligned in this country, African Americans. So would then, yes, I know I'm Black. I'm not denying I'm Black. I mean, right. So he would say these things. Look at my nose. Look at my hair. I'm definitely Black. But, and then the rest would be, I am not this group for these reasons. And there were similar reasons that you might hear from non-Black people. Right? It was a lot of times pejorative. You know, so it's an interesting thing where folks who are Black and come from communities that are Black also still have anti-Black ideologies, right? And we have to account for those things because we have to think about how in a society, the society as a collective is socialized within these power structures, right? These white supremacist power structures that are gonna socialize folks with anti-Black rhetoric, and that also is going to include Black people a lot of times. So and other non-white minority groups. So we have to think about and kind of account for how these things are going to be perpetuated even within amongst these groups. So that's a long answer to your question, but it definitely yeah, you know, that same thing, that same question is what prompted my mentor to do the other paper on Black Lives Matter, which is a group, you know, Black Lives Matter is a multi-ethnic Black contingency. The founders are from various places, some migrants, some not. One of them is Afro-Latinx, right? So, you know, in that group, in that study, there was a stronger pan-Black kind of racial identity where folks were, I think even the article is titled, "They don't care, all they see is Black skin, they don't care where it originated." And that was a direct quote from someone where it's like, hey, yeah, like I'm Dominican, you're African American, but at the end of the day, when we see this person, they're looking at us as Black as the same. So it's definitely more complicated than that, but that's a very good question. I think that definitely requires more attention.
Well, thanks for answering. I think you answered it beautifully, and I think it makes sense what you are saying. I was trying to prompt Alejandro, which he comes from the art department, right? And he's going to help us build a website. If he had some questions, he said most of the questions that the students already asked cover what he wanted. But seeing the art that you have in your background, and obviously thinking about how you represent visually Afro-Latinidad, right? And how you represent visually this idea of Black Latino, right? Do you have any suggestions? I know you are a sociology student, so you are not really an art student, right? But there are really towering figures in terms of art in Latin America that are African Afro-Latinos, right? And that they try to represent that reality in their art, right? So tell us, what do you think?
I think from a lot of the work that I've looked into talks about this idea of like Africanisms, right? And when they say that they're referring to relics or cultural traditions that have carried over through the diaspora, through the Middle Passage, have endured atrocities unimaginable, and have been so resilient that they're still being practiced today. And we see that across the diaspora in ways that that people wouldn't believe until you make those connections explicitly. I think one of the easiest ways, again, is music, right? So even the picture in my background is I think four or five Black men drumming, right? So instrumentation, cuisine, santeria, right? That's one of the easier ones. In Brazil, they're talking about what's the martial art dance? Capoeira, right? And a lot of instruments in Brazil. So a lot of these things are already being practiced and are already there. People aren't just making the connections, right? When you hear the call and response in Dominican Republic in palo, which is a type of music, you know, if you take the vocals out and you're just hearing the instrumentation, you're going to think it's from the continent, right? And then in many ways it's because it is. And you'll see that again in various places. In Haiti, a lot of the language structure for the Haitian Creole is going to have the same structure as some Bantu languages, right? And again, this is going to be the relics of the African diaspora. But when you make these connections explicitly, you can't deny it. You know, there's no way to deny it. And you see the strength and resilience of the diaspora throughout the Americas.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Alejandro was unable to watch the presentation last Friday, and I'm putting on the chat, Alejandro, in case we want to watch it, because we watch a documentary by Ebony Bailey that is called Jamaica y Tamarindo, and it really uses the metaphor of the Jamaica, the hibiscus and the tamarind, right, as coming from Africa and being central to Mexican cuisine, right? And she speaks about music, etc., right? That connects all these expressions of art in different forms and cuisine that are central to Mexican culture, that are from these diaspora, right? The African diaspora that came to Mexico.
Absolutely.
Somebody else had another question. I think Evelyn, do you want to ask her, or you want him to look at just at the? Is she around? I saw her question, but now she disappeared.
Yes, I'm here. So
Oh.
how could we empower Latin? Oh, I'm sorry. How can we empower Afro-Latinos who struggle with their own identity?
Yeah, you know that I've had a lot of students in my class who are Afro-Latinx, and would come to me and like, what do I do? And, you know, and it's a question that I've gotten several times, and it's not one that I can necessarily answer for people. You know, I present them with information, and you know, then I let them decide, or in some instances evolve into their identity. I think one thing is, in a more implicit way and sometimes explicit way, is making it known that, you know, I'm not talking about you in particular, but that the broader Latinx community should know that there are Black people here that are part of this community, and that they're welcome, right? Because a lot of times, and we saw this in the study even, folks are gonna say, hey, I need to be able to speak Spanish, otherwise I will never be authentically Afro-Latinx. And what does that even mean, right? So again, that's the boundary work we talked about earlier. But if we're gonna say, hey, we know someone who's Latinx can look indigenous, can look, I say look, right? What does it mean to look a particular anything? But someone can appear to be indigenous, someone can appear to be Black, and those people are also welcome in these spaces and not made to prove or authenticate or legitimize their identity. That I think that would help people step into themselves in a way that they don't have to choose one or the other, but they say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I look like. You know, I may or may not speak Spanish, but this is where I'm from, or this, right? So I think, and I hate to say the term because it's so overused and poorly, but making safe spaces or welcoming spaces, and maybe better than that is even making informed spaces where people are like, hey, I'm aware that people look all different types of ways in the Latinx community, and I want you to know that I know that, right? And that way may be more likely to maybe step into their identity. Good question.
It's a really good question, Evelyn. I think so, and I think we need to question that ourselves as well, right? We do have a publication in Nuevo Sol, and if you look at the content of the publication, we have very few items that really reflect these realities. So we're creating a space that is not welcoming to Afro-Latinos, right? So in a way, we're handicapped in that regard, and we're trying to, as Edlin is saying, right? We're willing to make ourselves vulnerable, right? To this idea that we want to be an ally, but we are not really there. We are still behind, and we need to help reflect on this. And then part of doing this project really is about that as well, not only about having an impact on Spanish language media or Latino media in general, who do a very poor job covering Black Latinos, right? Afro-Latinos.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll say, this ties back to the earlier question that I was just reminded of about being an ally. It's a little unrelated, but I think that the point still remains. We had a very racist incident happen in my department maybe 2 years ago. And I mean, like, about as racist as it can be. And in the midst of all that, in the midst of, you know, a lot of the diversity hearings and all the lip service that a lot of institutions kind of give to remedy these situations, there was a colleague of mine, a white man, who just took it upon himself to organize. He said, you know, we're gonna go. He ended up getting organizing a list of resources for the department. So he went and got people to come give to do workshops, to just very kind of various activities and things that, you know, some were more effective than others, but still had a better impact than if he hadn't done none. But one thing he did, he just took it upon himself to do that, and just he's like, hey, he came back to the group. This is what I have. What do you all think? Can you use any of this? If not, that's fine. So right in that way, he took it upon himself. He was vulnerable. He could have messed up really poorly, and not done anything worth for the cause. But he took it upon himself. Didn't try to take the lead. Kind of just say, hey, I did this. What do you all think? Can this be of service to you? Right. And it was very much, he did the work up front and then came like, hey, this is what I got. Can you use it? If not, no harm, no foul. And I think that was one of the better ways that I've seen people be an ally, who are out group members, be an ally to Black and Latinx people.
That's beautiful. That's a great example. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Yesenia, you have a question there. Can you ask her yourself? Are you there? Yes.
Yeah. So when I was reading your article, I was really just thinking of the future, and I think someone already asked, like, one of my questions was like, what teach future generations to stop this from happening? Because I was like, this is really sad. So basically, my question is, let me go back to it. They say that in the near future, mostly everyone in the United States will be a mixed race, a combination between races. And do you think this will actually happen? And if it does, do you believe discrimination against Black people and people of color will eventually stop?
Oof. So, I think in many ways, people who lay out these arguments or these perspectives, and we see it sometimes on CNN or MSNBC. They'll post a graphic. Even a couple years ago, I think it was like, the average person will look like this, and they had like a computer generated picture of what the average person would look like in 50 or so years. And again, it was someone, tanned with some features here and there that may be racially ambiguous. So yeah, a lot of people put forth this perspective. And I think if I can't answer definitively on that, but I will say, if history has taught us anything about so-called mixed countries or mixed communities, that has never fixed or ameliorated racial inequity. And we see that even among mixed race or interracial unions in the United States, right? A lot of times people, in fact, will think that because they have a spouse that is a racial ethnic minority, or a child that's a racial ethnic minority, that they themselves are absolved of anti-Blackness or racist ideologies or perspectives. And we know that not to be true. And in fact, a lot of mixed race research shows that the opposite, that the white parent oftentimes is one of the most aggressive or one of the most one of the largest proponents of anti-Blackness in these unions. And again, so we think about cosmic race, we think about racial democracy in Brazil, we think about the mixedness that we say we have in Dominican Republic. Even in those communities that do have some degree of mixing, to be fair, still have a spectrum where lighter skin is going to be advantaged and darker skin is going to be disadvantaged, and that's across the board in the Americas. Even on the continent of Africa, we see similar things due to colonialism. But yeah, so if it's up to me, and I'm saying, and I had to make a decision if it would stop discrimination or not, I would say that it probably will not stop discrimination, based on history, based on the data that we have currently.
I think people need to learn a different history, right? The real history of their country to understand and become more open to Black people, right? As they are not. I see you're tired, and I don't want to abuse your time. I know that you are busy as well. You're working probably on your dissertation as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
We wish you the best of luck. I want to ask you, would you be willing, if some of our students want to talk to you about the topic and then interview you separately, would you be willing to do that for them? And if there's a way that they can reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll put my email in the chat. That's my my school email. If you all have questions regarding your own projects, or even just about race in Latin America in general, I'll be happy to talk to you all. My dissertation work is a little different. It's on Haitian migrants in the Dominican Republic, so it's very related, but in a different kind of different context. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to talk to you all, and I was very happy to be here and to have so many thoughtful questions, and I'll be looking forward to see what you guys what you all are able to put forth in your publications and your
we'll make sure to do that, right? I mean, part of it, what students are learning, right, in journalism is that you go and talk to people, but you also give them back what you produce, so you don't abandon them and say, hey, goodbye, that's it. So I'm going to do my story, right? You have to let them know and also show that you're trying to honor, right, their stories, etc. Right?
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for doing this, and I should let you go so you can continue. I'm going to continue with the students, unless you want to continue longer.
Oh no, I think I need to get.
I saw you were tired. I saw you were
tired.
Yes. So I didn't want to abuse you. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you all, and have a great class.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey guys, now it's us only. So what's your thought?
Should I stop the recording?
Yes.